Hello and welcome to session 12, your lecture. This is part 1, and we'll dive right into our session aims, as usual, to chronicle the earliest development of Western medical thought and practice from about 3000 BCE to 2000 of the Common Era. So again, we're going back in time as we shift to another geographic location and another civilization or other early civilizations. We have to backtrack a little bit to pick up the thread. To demonstrate the movement of medical thought from supernatural to scientific, and up until now we've talked a lot about the supernatural being a part of the practice of healing across many cultures. To meet the key figures in medicine from this time, and those are Asclepius, Empedocles, Hippocrates, who I'm sure you've heard of before, Dioscorides, who is a foundational member of our herbal medicine in Western thought, and Galen. And to connect the development of medicine in this time to current natural therapies practice. Ancient Greek medicine came through 5 distinct periods, and through those periods of time, it enjoyed an evolution in thought from supernatural ideas about health and disease onto philosophical ideas, and then onto empirical, and finally to more scientific in terms of how we might define science today. And so we're going to travel in this lecture through that evolution of medical thought and these phases. The image here on this slide is of Asclepius. He is the son of Apollo, and he is said to be the god of medicine. And notice the snake wrapped around his staff. A snake wrapped around a staff has been a symbol of medicine through the ages, and this may be one of the earliest times of that being documented. So ancient Greek medicine flowed across a number of periods of history, and these are just briefly outlined here. The Cretan and Mycenaean or Minoan civilization period started about 3000 BCE, then came to the mythological period, and this was the time of Homer and Hesiod, and you may have heard of Homer and his books that he authored, and that was around 700 BCE. Then into the pre-Hippocratic period, and this was the period of the philosopher-scientists. If you recall from our last lecture talking about the Druids in the British Isles, they were in some ways kind of like philosopher-scientists. They certainly were philosophers, and of the sciences of the day of mathematics and astronomy, we believe that they were involved in that as well. And that started around 550 BCE in ancient Greece. Then the Hippocratic period, and that was the period of time that Hippocrates himself was influencing medicine and his followers. And then the post-Hippocratic period, which was the period of the Alexandrian medical sects, and that was in northern Egypt, starting around 300 BCE, and there was more of a Roman influence at that point in time. So we'll start with this earliest period, the Cretan Mycenaean period. The Minoan civilization was the main civilization during this period, which originated on Crete in the Bronze Age with settlement from about 7000 BCE, and there's evidence there of handmade ceramics from about 5000 BCE. And Minoan culture really flourished, though, from about 3000 to 1400 BCE. And the image here on this slide is of that civilization at the period of time when it was really flourishing and at its largest. And the pink areas are the areas, the pink and red areas are the ones that were influenced by that civilization. So the Minoan civilization was named after legendary King Minos, and he is associated with the labyrinth, which if you've ever walked a labyrinth before, then you'll know what that is. And the original labyrinth was designed and built for him to trap a minotaur in Greek myth. So if you're interested in Greek mythology, you might want to go surf around on the web or do some reading on that after we come through this lecture. Labyrinths have persisted to modern times in very similar designs to what they were during the Minoan civilization, and most of those have been associated with pagan culture, pre-Christian culture, and also esoteric contemplative traditions. The Minoan civilization was part of the larger Aegean region that's pictured here in pink, and which, like ancient Greece, included part of Asia Minor and on the mainland and islands of what is now Turkey. So we focus on the Minoan civilization in this time period because we see some important roots of our modern natural therapies here. The Minoans were a highly organized society. They had a mercantile economy, and they traded throughout the Mediterranean region. Their arts and crafts, metalwork, pottery, and wall paintings really show a focus on creating a pleasing aesthetic environment for themselves. And this might be the first time we really see this in history in terms of, in Western history, in terms of putting energy towards aesthetics. The image here on the slide is the ruins of the Knossos Palace on the island of Crete, and that is obviously a photograph taken in present times of the ruins of that castle. So the Minoan artwork that's left behind reveals a society that had quite a joyous disposition. They were very in touch with their environment, and they seemed to be really in awe of the logical order of the natural world. So there was this focus on nature. Artifacts of the period indicated people who had a highly developed degree of civilization and had self-respect and a keen eye for observing and adapting to their physical environments. In the Minoan civilization, women enjoyed a high place in society, with indications that they were considered equal to men. The natural world was deified by the Minoans, so that it was worshipped, with the view of nature as having a logical order and a desire to live in harmony with it. So you can see why the later Romans would group together the later civilizations in this area that continued to have this living in concert with nature as being part of their way of being, part of their culture, why that would have gotten grouped together with the folks that were further to the west, who also had a nature-based spirituality and put under the label of pagan. So the image here is a tapestry that was on a throne room of the Palace of Knossos at Crete. The image there is called a griffin couchant. And their religious practices are what we would now classify as pagan in nature. And again, using that word to mean the word used by the Christians to refer back to pre-Christian nature-based spirituality. They participated in both animal and bloodless sacrifices, along with they had processions that were part of their ritual worship of great female nature goddesses. And during these festivals, worshipers used music, dance, and prayer to achieve a high state of religious ecstasy that put them in touch with the supernatural. There was a sacrifice ritually of a bull, and bull leaping games were a central part of the Minoan religious festivals. These symbolized man's interaction with very powerful natural forces, with the bull being a symbol of the power of nature, and ultimately his triumph, man's triumph through skill and power in leaping the bull. We get in now to talking about hygiene for the first time, and the first understanding that we have of humans really focusing on hygiene. So the palaces of the Minoan civilization had sophisticated systems of water supply and drainage. They had rudimentary toilets where water was piped in or poured by jug to carry waste away from the building. And bathtubs have been excavated from palace ruins. So we know that they actually bathed in their houses, or at least in palaces, the wealthy did. And they might have also had aqueducts which carried water over larger distance. And we see more of this later on in the Roman culture. That was a mainstay of Roman culture. So this is some of the earliest evidence in the Western world of the awareness of the importance of hygiene to public health, as well as to aesthetics, which was clearly a focus of this civilization. And it would have been more pleasing to have clean environments, obviously, and a more ordered lifestyle just in general. So there's evidence that they had water tanks with ducts and drains to collect rainwater, which is something that we sort of take it for granted nowadays, but it was a new development at that point in time, as well as having drains that would that would carry away sewage. So not having those open where the smells and sites of it were out and exposed. So again, worrying about or being concerned about the aesthetics and the containment of things that are unpleasant. When the civilization was destroyed, it may have been by a volcanic eruption or earthquakes or tidal waves, so some kind of natural disaster event. But ultimately, the palaces were all burnt, and all of the plumbing and sewage design was actually destroyed in that process. So the following civilization had to start over, and they weren't actually building on the infrastructure of the Minoan civilization. A lot of knowledge was lost in the destruction of this civilization, and the level of engineering that we see with the Minoans was not seen again until later in the Roman civilization. So the later Greek civilizations in that area didn't really demonstrate this. Minoan medicine was similar to a lot of the nature-based medicines that we've seen so far this semester. So we're in the pre-scientific era still. They had a diverse flora, plant life that flourished in the mild climate of Crete, from which they gleaned food and medicinal herbs as well. And they also seem to have the capabilities to process plants in certain ways, because equipment was found in relation to the artifacts of this civilization with things like distillation jars. And those were found with organic residues of many herbs, including lavender, laurel, sage, rosemary, coriander, cumin, dittany, rue, saffron, safflower, anise, verbena, aleppo pine, and myrtle and fig. So quite a wide array of plant residues found that indicate that they were distilling and utilizing these herbs medicinally. And their medicine was completely interwoven with religion, as we've seen in other cultures. In the image here, we see a Cretan goddess, and notice that she is holding two snakes. And we have this recurring symbolism of the snake associated with healing and medicine in this Cretan snake goddess who was considered to be a healer. And because of the extent of destruction of the civilization and the fact that their written language has never been deciphered, they did have a written language, but has never been deciphered, we really don't know much more about the Minoans, such as things like what they considered to be the cause of disease. The Mycenaeans came just towards the end of the period of the Minoan civilization, and was a brief period in Greek history from 1400 to 1100 BCE. And there was a move of the center of civilization from the Aegean, like we saw on the map a few slides back, onto mainland Greece. And the main historical event during this period was the Trojan War, which I'm sure that you've at least seen movies about at this point in time. And that ran from 1194 to 1184 BCE. That was followed by the Dark Ages of the Greek Dark Ages from 1100 to 800 BCE. And the prevalence of war in these times meant that the focus of medicine was really on surgery, on treating wounds, preventing infection, controlling pain, and stopping bleeding. And those were, in periods of war across multiple cultures, those were the early development of surgery is owed to warfare, essentially. It doesn't appear at this period in history that disease epidemics were a major factor in life or the fall of these civilizations, and we don't know much about the particular diseases that they experienced or suffered from, although certainly there were diseases. And it appears as though natural disaster or external invasions were responsible for the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. So that's the end of part one of this lecture. We don't have any separate revision questions for this part, so you'll have revision questions at the end of part two that will apply across part one and two. So I'll see you again in part two shortly.